Okay, A-Push. This is our second video and it's taking a look at how to write an A-Push thesis statement. And I'm going to give you a couple tips on how to create a thesis statement using an actual formula, similar to what you use in math. But what's great about this formula is it's something that if you memorize and can continue to practice and do, by the time that you're forced to write a thesis statement within 5 minutes, or so on any kind of timed exam, that thesis statement's going to be really easy, it's going to come to you really quick, and there's been a lot of success with this type of formula. So let's get started. The first thing we need to know is what is a thesis statement. There are typically 3 parts to a thesis statement in any class: English, science, social studies, and these are typically 2 to 3 sentences that tells the reader what your argument is, how you will interpret the significance of the subject. Very quick, very specific. What is your argument? What is the significance? And then those things that tell us how to interpret my argument, those 3 categories. So on Friday, we created in our pre-writing session 3 categories that we organized all of our brainstormed ideas into. That's what this is, those 3 categories. And then finally, it analyzes an opposing or alternate viewpoint. I always say that history has 3 parts, and a story has 3 parts: yours, mine, and the truth. And so we have to see that there is another side to the story. There's your side, there's my side, and then your paper, your argument, is really trying to determine that your side is the truth. But to make that very clear, you have to recognize that there's another viewpoint out there, and then you want to explain why your viewpoint supersedes that viewpoint. And so we'll practice all of these things this year. Those are your 3 parts that you want. Now, what is not a thesis statement? There are some things that we come into writing a thesis statement that we might kind of think, oh, that must be a thesis statement, it's got to be it. And we have to get out of that habit. So a thesis statement is not. It is not a fact. It is an informed interpretation of a fact. So we all have opinions about things, but if we can be informed and if we can provide evidence, then that starts and that evidence is the facts, then that starts to give us a better understanding of what a thesis statement is, and that's leading more toward a thesis statement. So a thesis statement is using facts to create and form an opinion. So it's not George Washington was the first president. It would be George Washington set many precedents, did many firsts that still rule the presidency today. So that's just kind of a basic example. A thesis statement is not an opinion, but a reasoned judgment of a student. And finally, a thesis statement is not the first sentence of your essay. However, it is your last sentence in your introductory paragraph. No essay I should ever read, or anyone should ever read, should have a thesis statement first. You have to introduce the reader to the topic. You have to give context, or the reader is going to be lost. If you jump right into your argument, the reader is going to wonder what in the world is going on. You have to put your thesis statement at the end of the introductory paragraph. And when you look at the DBQ rubric, you see that there is a specific piece to the thesis and argument development. This is very similar to the long essay question rubric 2 on the AP exam, but I just pulled out the DBQ rubric for this example. So you can get 2 points for thesis. First point is that you present the thesis. It makes a historically defensible claim, so you've made an argument, and it responds to all parts of the question. It has to consist of 1 or more sentences located in one place, either in the introduction or the conclusion. The reason they state that your thesis could be in the conclusion is typically your conclusion paragraph would restate your original thesis. Sometimes students get very nervous at the beginning of the writing process, and their thesis can be a little muddled. So they give the readers kind of throw you a bone in a sense that you can write that thesis at the end and they'll still give you the point. However, it's really important to try and get it up front so they're not looking for that thesis statement. And finally, the second point would be that you have to develop and support a cohesive argument that recognizes and accounts for historical complexity, that other side to the story. That's what they're talking about with historical complexity. That illustrates relationships among historical evidence. So this piece, developing and supporting a cohesive argument, is what the rest of your essay looks at. So this is your actual statement. This is what is in your essay that is supporting the statement. So you're going to hear me say a lot this year. Make sure you go back to your thesis statement. Connect it back to your thesis statement. Connect it to your argument. Anything you write in your essay, you're going to hear me say it over and over again. And that's because that's where you get this point. But really important to remember, you have to get the first point, so you have to have a thesis in there before you can get the second point. So if you don't have a thesis, or if your thesis is not clear, then you're going to miss out on 2 full points in your DBQ or your long essay. So that's part of the reason why the thesis is so important. And it goes along with the idea, if you have a strong thesis statement, the rest of your essay writes itself. The rest of your essay is going to be organized. You have a weak thesis statement, the essay is going to be weak. You see that in all types of writing. Now, when it comes to our skills, those that are specifically focused on in AP, there are 9 total skills, but there are 4 major ones, we call these the big 4, that are directly assessed in the writing portion. So you're going to get a question on the writing portion of the exam that's going to focus on historical causation, patterns of continuity and change over time, periodization, or comparison. And again, you can see down here that there are 3 parts to the exam that are specifically focused on writing, short answer questions, which we'll focus on a little bit later, but then your DBQ and your long essay question, or your LEQ. And that's where you're going to focus really on these big 4. And notice, document-based question, 55 minutes, long essay question, 35 minutes. So you don't have a whole lot of time, but these videos and these skills and that we're going to be practicing, the formulas, are going to help us really use our time wisely and be able to help you focus, so that timing piece is going to come a little bit more naturally later on. So what does the writing process look like? Let's first break it down. First, you have to know what you're writing about. A lot of students miss a lot of points because they don't answer the full question. They don't understand the whole question, or there are pieces that they focus on at the beginning, and they really don't focus on the last part of the prompt or the question. This actually happened this year in the DBQ. The DBQ was on women's rights and how it progressed. I believe it was the change in continuity of women's rights. And a lot of students focused on women's rights, but they didn't focus on that change in continuity part. And so they lost a lot of points because they were able to examine the movement, but they weren't able, or they got really excited, or they really just didn't look at the rest of the prompt, and they didn't get that second piece where they explain the change in continuity. So you have to break down the prompt. Okay, so you want to circle the task at hand. What are you asked to do? Then underline the historical subject. Make sure you know what time period you're supposed to stay in. And then finally, box out that time period. So know the task, know the subject, find the time period. So for example, the South never had a chance to win the Civil War. To what extent do you agree or disagree? So your task is finding out to what extent do you agree or disagree. The topic is the South and the Civil War. And then we're going ahead and inferring that the time period is the antebellum South, so the time period before the Civil War to 1865, just based on what it says. The South never had a chance to win the Civil War. You have to look at what's going on before you can understand why they didn't have a chance. And then the second one, discuss the political, economic, and social reforms introduced in the South between 1864 and 1877. To what extent did these reforms survive the Compromise of 1877? So your task is to discuss and to what extent. Your topic is political, economic, social reforms in the South. And then again, how did those reforms survive the Compromise of 1877? And so you're focused on that time period, 1864 to 1877. So you got to understand what the prompt is asking you to do. From there we go. You then want to complete your pre-writing steps, which is what we went over on Friday. So you want to make sure that you brainstorm all of those pieces that could possibly go with that question. You want to then organize those into your 3 topics. Then break down those 3 topics. Put those details in order, come up with evidence, more evidence, find quotes or any kind of pieces that will support that if it's maybe a DBQ. And then you want to then organize all of those pieces. So how are you going to put that into an essay? And then double check that your thesis answers all parts of the prompt. So you're going to write your thesis once you have everything organized there in that outline. Write your thesis using the formula, and your formula will come very naturally at that point if you complete those pre-writing steps. And then make sure it answers the full prompt. ATFP, you will see it a lot. Answer the full prompt. Okay, and this is a table that you're going to get. I also put it on here for your, so you can review it. But these are some of the things that you might be asked to do. Analyze, to what extent, discuss, compare, contrast, explain. It's asking you specifically to do something. Make sure that you, if you're asked to explain, you tell how things work or how they came to be. Explain it fully, giving descriptions or analysis, and detail to give it meaning. So make sure you refer back to this, especially when you're answering different questions. So this all leads up to what is the thesis formula. And so in math, you use formulas all the time. Let's add in numbers to this equation. Let's complete this formula, and then you get the answer. I'm not a math person, so I'm really struggling to explain this formula. So let's do it in a historical sense. So for the formula, you have the terms X, A, B, C, and Y. Remember those. X, A, B, C, and Y. So X represents the strongest point against your argument. So think of X, if you're going to X something out, that normally means that that's against, right? So it represents the strongest point against your argument. It's called the counter argument. That's that other side to the story. So you're trying to tell your side, the X is trying to tell my side of the story. A, B, C are those 3 strongest points for your argument. Those are those 3 categories you created in your pre-writing. So anytime you see A, B, and C, just think of your 3 categories. And then Y is your actual argument, your stand on the prompt. Again, remember, clear and answer the full prompt. So X, counter, argument, A, B, C, 3 topics, Y, your argument. And this can come about in 2 different ways. You can use and plug into this formula, although X, Y because A, B, C, or X, so the counter argument stands alone. However, A and B, so in this one it uses two specific points for your argument or two topics. And then therefore, Y. So let's take a look at how that actually comes to be, and it'll make a little bit more sense when you see it in play. So if you're thinking of your big four formulas, you're also going to receive a handout that gives you this information. But this is what it looks like when you're using although X, Y, because A, B, C. So if you have a continuity and change over time question, you're going to see that if X would be your counter argument, A, B, C is the specific time period broken up into organizational categories, and Y is your actual argument. Same here with big four formula, X, however A and B, therefore Y. So you have two different formulas, you just have to see what works for you. And you're going to find that you might become partial to one over the other, and that's okay. Or sometimes you're going to find that depending on the writing topic, one works better for you than the other. So just see what, as we practice, just go along with what you feel most comfortable with. So let's actually put this together. Here's a question. Evaluate the extent to which westward migration in the later 19th century contributed to maintaining continuity as well as fostering change in the United States. So we know that this is change in continuity over time. There you go. The question is asking you to evaluate the extent. The topic is westward migration, and it's focused in the later 19th century. So, X is maintaining. I'm going to argue that X is the counter argument, so that that some people may say that westward migration maintained continuity culturally. The culture was very similar. But my argument is going to be, though, that westward migration really led to so many dramatic changes overall. And I'm going to focus specifically on geography, economics, and politics. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so here's my X. Although westward migration in the later 19th century propagated the spirit of manifest destiny and white dominance, which was consistent with westward expansion in the early 19th century, with things like the addition of new states in the Louisiana Territory and the Trail of Tears, the movement westward in the later half of the 19th century fostered change to a greater extent than it maintained continuity. Change came economically with new technology, resources, and labor, politically with new Western political organizations and agendas, and geographically with dramatic changes to the environment. So you see here in red, what I've done is I've stated, yes, we do see that there are elements that culturally that have stayed the same. However, if I'm looking at the extent to which this maintained continuity or change, my argument is really, look, it really fostered more change. It had a lot more change. And so when I come down here to explain my topics, I've given the topic of economically, but I've also really made it clear that I'm going to focus on how it changed economically with new technology, resources, and labor. So you already know that that paragraph that's focused on economics is going to focus on technology, resources, and labor. I've made it very, very clear. Okay, so this does seem like a lot in terms of a thesis statement, but also it's kind of jammed in there in a little box. So when you would actually write this, it would look a little bit more like 2 or 3 sentences than it does as a whole paragraph right now. So let's take a look at the opposite. Let's take a look at a pretty weak thesis. So we're going to focus on the same question, okay, and the same argument. But the weak thesis, although westward migration maintained continuity, it fostered change to a greater extent because of changes in politics, economics, and geography. Okay? And so here, if I'm the reader, I'm sitting here thinking, how? So what? And you'll see that history really focuses on answering the so what question. Although westward migration maintained continuity. So what? So why do I care that it maintained continuity? You haven't given me an example of how. So you can see that this is very bare bones. And it's not going to get the thesis point because there really isn't anywhere to go. You could write anything at this point with maintaining continuity. And making it pretty vague and bare bones like this leaves you open to sometimes contradicting yourself in writing. So maybe you start writing about continuity and then you use that same idea or that same example for continuity and you start to say that it's changed because you haven't really worked it out and made it very specific. So you want to be very, very careful with that. Make sure that your thesis is very specific. The more specific it is, the more organized and detailed your essay is going to be, the easier it is to write, and the less you're going to have those chances for contradictions or less detail. So you're really going to get into the points there. Okay. I'm going to bring this up. I wanted to give you another example of a weak thesis statement. So if you're looking at the prompt, to what extent was the late 19th and early 20th century U.S. expansion a continuation of past U.S. expansion, and to what extent was it a departure? So your task is to what extent. Your time period is 19th and 20th century, and your topic is expansion. And then you're taking a look at that big four piece, just like we did a minute ago. So a weak thesis. America was not in a state of expansion in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were just in a state of manifest destiny. America annexed Hawaii in 1998 and then went to war with Spain and took Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We never added Puerto Rico as a state, but it and Guam are still American territories. American Samoa, too, which was taken from Germany. Give you a minute to think about why this is a weak thesis. Okay. Couple things here. It's not answering the question. Okay. Starts to try. They were in a state of manifest destiny. That's starting to try and argue that it's a continuation, but it doesn't make it clear. Also, these things here are just facts, absolute facts, and wrong facts at that. America annexed Hawaii in 1998. Not true. Okay, so we did annex Hawaii, but it was not in the 90s. Okay, so careful, careful, careful. Here's your strong thesis for this prompt. Okay, although in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States departed from a George Washington-style neutrality and began to assert themselves on the world stage, evident in the Pan-American Conference. The United States expansion was actually a departure from past foreign policy, only to a small extent, and a continuation of the past ways to a large extent, due to similarities socially, politically, and economically. So you see that our X here, we see that the other side of the story, the counter argument, is that this is beginning to move into more of a departure. And right here, this thesis statement actually talks a little bit about that departure, the fact that it was a departure in a small extent. So because you're looking at the extent, it was to a small extent, but that the argument is actually that this was a continuation to a large extent, and then focusing on social, political, and economically. Now the question I ask is, what could you add to make this thesis stronger? And to give you a hint, take a look at that bottom, social, political, economic. What do you need to add to this to make it stronger? You need to add details so you have a very clear path as to what you are going to write. So I hope this video is something that you can continue to review, go back to, even if you don't want to listen and you just want to watch and look at some of these examples of thesis statements, please do that. And if you have any questions, make sure you come see me. We're going to continue to practice this multiple times this year. So make sure that any questions that come up, you ask and we will work through them and you will be strong thesis writers by the end of the year, I guarantee it. Okay? So see you in your third video, which is focused on introductory paragraph.